all men need to learn how to fight. And not just for the obvious self-defense reasons. Yes, we should all be prepared for worst case scenarios, but you should also know CPR and how to change a tire too, and I bet most of you don't. The real reason why all men need to learn how to fight is much more deep and immediate. Combat is the most primal social function of masculinity. It is why men have the tendencies that we do. It is why all male interest outside of women is basically a sublimation of combat. And it also gives us a clue to why there is nothing that will develop intangible positive qualities in a man more than learning to fight. And to be clear, I'm definitely not advocating violence. I've actually never been in a real street fight. I also didn't go very far in combat sports. I have a few years high school wrestling. I did a couple of amateur boxing bouts, and in my 30s, I got into jiu-jitsu. But I've also been in men's personal development for over a decade, and I don't think anything comes close as far as a pastime than learning combat sports. So in this video, I'm going to share some of the things I've learned in learning different martial arts over the years, some of the hidden benefits as far as how it affects a man's deepest psychology, and also a couple suggestions for anyone just getting started. The first change a man goes through when learning how to fight, before anything else, is purely mental. When I was 15, I was extremely depressed. And I was experiencing life in the way that I've heard from many guys when they're depressed, which is life doesn't feel real and nothing you do seems to matter. And I had tried many things to get out of depression. And then finally, I started boxing and wrestling. And in wrestling especially, just like anyone starting out, I got my ass kicked. And there are a few things more humiliating to the male ego than to have another man dominate you physically. But at the same time, there was something that I couldn't put into words back then that was also so fulfilling, even in getting pinned, even in getting ragdolled. Fulfilling because I felt real. And over the months, I could see as I learned skills, as my body got stronger, it's like something on a very primal level mattered. Similar thing when I started boxing, I actually had trained for a couple months before I ever sparred. So I could hit the pads, I could hit the bag in a way that looked impressive, at least to people who didn't box. And I remember the first time I stepped into the ring against another kid. He was a couple years older than me, he had some experience, and I just couldn't hit him. And it wasn't because he was way more skilled than me. He definitely wasn't faster than me. But I couldn't hit him because of these internal inhibitions that I had that I think actually were totally analogous to all my other inhibitions in life, social inhibitions, where I couldn't bring myself to penetrate another man's space with my fist. There's just something in me, like an invisible force that locked it up until he tagged me really good. And it kind of dropped me out of my anxiety. And finally, I was able to break through and actually hit him. And it was a major breakthrough in my life, this one punch that I landed, because on the, again, most primal level of fulfillment, there are few things that are more stimulating to your androgen receptors, let's say, than landing a clean punch on someone. Modern life is increasingly abstract. More and more people are working online rather than with their hands. So much communication is like this video through an electronic screen. It's great for information, but it's missing a lot of the real human experience. Our money, our dating lives has been sent into the electronic world rather than the real world. And this is especially damaging for men, especially young men, because the things that we've evolved to be good at and interested in are less and less valued in our society, which is why you see so many young men spending their time in fantasy realms, because that's where they can feel more fulfillment. And you see a lot of young men, again, with fantasy views of love and romance and sex and fighting. So many guys have a fantasy view of violence where they think, because they've seen a bunch of Marvel movies, they can knock out someone with one punch or stay on their feet if someone grappled with them, because they have no basis in reality, right? It's pure fiction in their head. So funny enough, I actually had an incident with this kind of person just a couple weeks ago. There's this guy, I met him a couple times at the coffee shop I go to, and we're in a group chat that the coffee shop owner started, and this guy just starts trolling me. I didn't get it because the few times I've interacted with him in person, he's been super polite. So I shot him a message just like, hey man, I maybe don't get your sense of humor, but this isn't cool with me. And if he just responded with something like, oh, I'm sorry, I don't know what I was thinking, I was just being stupid, I would have dropped it and never thought of it again. But he decided to be a tough guy. He kept escalating. I asked him another question to give him another out. Because honestly, I'm 35 years old, I have a family, I'm not trying to get into a fist fight at a coffee shop. But he decided to keep escalating and escalating. And I was just like, listen, I don't know why you have a problem with me. If you were an internet troll, I would have just blocked you. But we live in the same town. We go to the same places. We're going to see each other again. So whatever your issue is with me, why don't we just meet up tomorrow and settle this, right? I even invited him to the local gym to put on boxing gloves and basically fight it out without anyone getting seriously hurt. So he calls me, still posturing, acting like a tough guy, But with surprise in his voice, he said, "What, you want to escalate this to violence?" And I was surprised that he was surprised because he started it, right? Because in my model of reality, there's no way that one man disrespects another man repeatedly and there's no physical consequences. But then I realized, oh, this is not where he's coming from, right? He's literally an internet troll. He probably does this all day. He probably gets most of his fulfillment by making other people feel bad on the internet. And it actually didn't cross his mind that when you talk shit to someone who lives in the same town as you, there might be physical consequences. So honestly, when I realized all this, it took away my aggression. I feel a sense of peace about it. I haven't seen him since. He hasn't showed up to the coffee shop since, but I don't know what I would do. I don't feel any hostility towards him. I basically feel at peace. But it's not an abstract peace. It's not a peace that comes from sitting on a meditation cushion and thinking compassion. It's a peace based on reality, right? Because the flip side of it is men who do train in fighting typically don't go around starting fights. One, because the natural aggression that testosterone gives us has been released, right? In an evolutionary, consistent environment, we would have tons of natural outlets for our aggression. In modern day, if you live in a developed world, you kind of have to find this for yourself. And combat sports is the perfect place, right? It taps into all of those triggers that would basically let you expel those pent-up emotions. And the second thing is when you've actually fought, when you've actually trained, even in a safe environment like a combat sports gym, you do have a clear sense of what could happen in a real street fight, right? There's so many things that could go wrong, even if you're bigger, even if you're badder, someone trips, someone falls, cracks their head, dies, As much as I do kind of feel like he deserves a punch in the face, I wouldn't want anyone to get seriously injured, which is why I invited him to the boxing club instead. And in all honesty, if he was way bigger than me, if he was like 240 and jacked, I probably wouldn't have acted so courageously. Because anyone who actually trains knows that size definitely does matter in fights. Rickson Gracie has said that every belt level in jiu-jitsu is roughly the equivalent of 10 kg of body mass. That's 22 pounds for you metrically challenged. And grappling especially teaches you to size people up pretty accurately. Wrestling in high school, when you go to another school for a meet, the first thing everyone's doing is looking at the other team to see who's my weight, who's the guy that I'm going to go head to head with, and you get pretty good at sizing people up. The next change a man goes through when learning to fight is emotional. Many people point to some of the obvious superficial things. When you learn to fight, you develop confidence, you develop some sort of resilience, but there's actually a scientific term that can be measured that changes when you get better at fighting. Richard Dienstbier, researcher, coined the term physiological toughness, which he defines as the ability to remain calm and focused under stress. Stress, in this case, is defined as any perceived potential harm or loss. And this is something that can actually be measured physiologically. While in modern day life, most of us don't have to worry about literal physical harm to our bodies or direct survival loss on a regular basis, everything in life that matters to you is in some way related to your survival. Therefore, everything in your life that matters to you will lead to some sort of stress. So your utility as a man comes down to your ability to handle this kind of stress in your body. In John Coates' book, The Hour Between Dog and Wolf, he actually lays out a situation where two individuals, two stock traders, one who's physiologically tough and one who's not, will have very different neuroendocrine responses to the same bad news. Say the stock market crashing. Because the stock market crashing is something that triggers all of our survival fears, even though it's not as literal as a giant predator in front of you or barbarians coming over the hill. It triggers the same kind of hormonal response. So both traders will have an adrenaline spike, right? There's a threat. Adrenaline starts pumping. But the physiological tough trader, the one who's seasoned, the one who can handle more in his nervous system, will start to calm down. His adrenaline will drop and different hormones will turn on. Noradrenaline, which is associated with aggression, testosterone will actually increase to deal with the crisis at hand. Whereas the physiologically weak trader won't be able to calm himself down. His adrenaline will keep going and going until he's basically out of adrenaline. And then he'll switch into prey mode, right? His cortisol will come in to basically get him away from the threat because his body will keep perceiving threat, threat, threat. Oh my God, we're about to die. And of course, you can imagine which trader is going to make the better decisions. The one who thinks he's going to die or the one who's now becoming the predator, the one who's becoming aggressive, the one who's metaphorically ready to fight. So even though we think of things like confidence and resilience as this mental or emotional thing, this abstract thing, it's actually something that can be measured in our bodies. When you learn how to handle perceived threats in a more calm manner, it actually changes your your physiology. It changes your hormonal response, your neurotransmitter response to the same events. And there's nothing that can trigger this primal threat response in a safe manner than combat sports. One of the first things that anybody experiences when they start something like jiu-jitsu for the first time is basically to not freak out when someone's on top of you, right? Most people go into some sort of panic mode, especially if they've never dealt with something like that before. And I've introduced a lot of my friends to jiu-jitsu. All of them say after their first class, wow, I didn't know my endurance was so bad. A lot of my friends who are in really good shape will try jiu-jitsu and get so tired in the beginning, thinking that they're like so out of shape. And I always tell them, like, it's not that you're out of shape. It's that you probably had a huge adrenaline dump and you didn't know how to remain calm. You probably were hyperventilating. You probably weren't breathing. And that is actually why you're so exhausted. It's not because you're physically out of shape. It's because you don't know how to emotionally remain calm when someone's on top of you. And when I look back at how I reacted to different issues in my life, certain crises or emergencies, it's not to say that I've always acted perfectly, right? Certainly not. But certainly, had I not had many hours on the mat where I got to practice essentially having a more physiologically tough and calm response, certainly my reactions would have all been worse. Because this is not to knock the value of meditation, but it is one thing to sit on a cushion where there's no physical stakes and think, okay, I will be at peace with the world. Is another thing to have someone literally trying to restrict your airflow and also have that thought, right? One is no stakes, one is very high stakes. And if you can do it under pressure, you can do that in most situations in your life. So we talked about the mental changes. We talked about the emotional changes. There's another level of change when a man learns to fight that happens on what we could call the fulfillment level, dare I say spiritual level. Because again, the most primal function of masculinity, the reason why our androgen receptors respond to certain things is for protection of the tribe, which is why learning to fight, even if it's just in the gym, I think especially, I would hope that all of your fighting stays in a safe environment. There's nothing that will tap into those reward circuitries as well as learning combat, because that is why we have all of the tendencies that we have as men. All sports are basically a sublimation of combat. Individual sports are simulating single combat, team sports are simulating pitched battles, video games, even chess is a sublimation of combat where you're using strategy to overpower and defeat your enemy. But actually training in combat sports hits these circuits directly, right? It's less of a sublimation than actual combat because it still is combat. And therefore, it instills a level of self-respect that I don't think you could achieve as directly anywhere else. And this is important not only for the individual man, but anyone he interacts with, whether in relationship, in family, in society as a whole. Because when you look at some of the most unfortunate expressions of male aggression today, such as something as terrible as a school shooting, the issue actually isn't the aggression. Men on average are probably far less aggressive than they were in previous generations. And also attempts to neuter men, to really take away their aggression, one, doesn't ever actually work. And two, is not good for society, right? If there was no aggression in men, our society would be taken over pretty quickly by another more aggressive society. The issue isn't the aggression. The issue is a lack of honor. Honor comes with the recognition that if you disrespect someone, there will be physical consequences. If someone disrespects you or threatens your family, you have to create those physical consequences. If society still instilled honor in men, we wouldn't have so many fatherless homes. We wouldn't see a lot of the crimes or exploitations of strong people by weak people. Honor is a spiritual value in the sense that if you actually believe in honor, you will do hard things that benefit people you care about, even if the immediate material incentives say otherwise. And for our Paleolithic ancestors, honor wasn't a choice, right? Any individual that didn't have honor would have been defeated pretty soon. Any society that didn't have honor would have been captured and enslaved by one that did. But nowadays, because our lives are so comfortable, because most of us don't have to deal with our immediate survival or security on a regular basis, honor has become this extra abstract thing that people can make fun of as this archaic male notion. And it's something that doesn't actually have ties to reality unless you make it. And combat sports, training to fight, is something that reinstills that in you. Because there is no way to abstract getting punched in the face or punching someone in the face. There is no way to abstract choking someone out or getting choked out. This is real. These are real things that imply real dire physical consequences. And this might seem a little strange or funny in the context of masculinity, but there is nothing that two straight guys can do with each other that is more intimate than fighting. When you spar with someone, be it in boxing or grappling, you really feel who they are. You see what they're like under pressure. You see what they're like when they have the upper hand. You see what they're like when they have the lower hand. Or you get to actually feel what another man feels like. And if you've trained a bunch, you know both sides, right? You've been smashed by someone. You've probably smashed someone. You actually can have compassion and empathize with someone in a way that is not at all abstract. Because in other areas of life, it is so easy for a man to posture his strength or even posture compassion. But in actual fighting, you know. And you also really get to know yourself. You get to see what you're actually like in both of those situations. If you act like a little bitch when you're about to get tapped out, you have to admit that to yourself. And if you have the courage to keep training, then you have to decide, okay, I'm going to change that reaction to myself because that is not acceptable. And if you do that, when you do that, you get to see your progression and to develop a real sense of confidence that comes from knowing you actually did the hard things in combat with another man. In conclusion, I've been in men's personal development for a very long time. There are a lot of things that I think are extremely useful for a man to improve himself, but I don't think there's anything as foundational as learning combat sports, learning to fight. So if you're looking for a hobby, this is the thing that I would suggest more than anything. Take a jiu-jitsu class, go to a boxing gym, and stick with it long enough to see yourself improve. And I promise you, everything across the board will get better.